Good morning, everyone. Thank you for all attending. We're just getting started. We're just got a couple of people still joining. Give us about 30 seconds and we're going to get started. Okay. Well, thank you again for attending this morning's webinar with our special guest, Huzu Saifee from Nutanix. We're going to talk today. We can go to we're going to talk today, and Huzu, you can switch. Yep, there we go. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that we've spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of months talking about, the new reality of remote workforce, how VDI plays into this, as well as other aspects of remote work capabilities. We've done a number of these webinars recently. Today we decided to bring in one of the experts from Nutanix, Huzu Saifee, who is been working on the Nutanix Frame platform for quite a while, and he's going to be talking today about their solution. I've spent some time talking about that in previous webinars that some of you may have attended. We're going to talk specifically today about the value proposition, how and what challenges it specifically solves, why Storcom also, we have a solution based upon using the Nutanix Frame platform, and where we see the value of that solution from a application, remote workforce and application publishing standpoint. So with that being said, we're going to kind of get into this. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the technology, the architecture, and we're going to get into a demo. Certainly want to open this up for questions. So please feel free to type in some questions and I will field those and get those over to Huzu. And just a little bit real briefly about Storcom, if you're not familiar with us. We're a managed service solution provider. We have been working here in the Midwest for over 20 years. We have an MSP offering doing desktop as a service as well as remote file sharing services as it pertains to remote workforce. We've been focusing for quite a while now on kind of remote workforce and desktop as a service solutions, and kind of building a practice around that. So this is an area that is close to us from a SME standpoint and being able to provide overall solution options. And as I said, we've been working with the Nutanix Frame platform now for a while. Have quite a bit of experience with that. We manage the platform ourselves. So everything you're seeing here with what Huzu is going to do from a demo standpoint, we can certainly follow up and show you and get you access to anybody who might be interested in this. Further, we can get you access to systems where you can do some testing yourself. So with that said, we have quite a long presentation today from the standpoint of a lot we're going to cover. So I'm going to turn this over to Huzu and let him get started, and we'll get into the first section of the presentation.
Yep. Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. This is Huzu Saifee from Nutanix Frame team. Been working with Dave for a while jointly on some of these solutions. So happy to have the opportunity to speak to you all. I'm here based out of Dallas. I've spent a number of years in end user computing ecosystem. I've worked at other vendors. I've worked at the customer side as well for many years. So fairly familiar with the end user computing landscape in general. So I'm going to dive in. I have a few slides to kind of set the stage to give you a good overview of the Frame platform. And then, like Dave mentioned, I'm going to go in and go over the actual demo of the environment so you can see what it looks like from a user perspective and touch on a little bit on the administration side as well. Again, while this is a webinar, we want to keep this you guys engaged, so please ask questions in the questions portal, and we'd be happy to stop and pause and answer those questions as they come up. And we'll have other opportunities for you guys to ask questions as well as we pause through this. So I'd like to start off, give you a little bit of background and history on Frame. So Frame is actually a technology that was founded back in 2012 by this gentleman named Nikola Buznovich, who's now heads Nutanix's overall end user computing division. But back then, he was actually working on his PhD on next-gen remoting protocols, which led to what is now Frame. And he was at that time, he had a couple of goals in mind. One of his primary tenets was to make VDI simple from a user perspective as well as from an administration perspective, and make it a cloud native solution, which traditional VDI, especially at that time, was not. The second thing he wanted to focus on was to be able to deliver high graphics workloads such as AutoCAD, Revit, Photoshop, and those kind of applications through a VDI solution, and especially back in 2012, that's something that traditional VDI tended to shy away from. So what he did was he developed a proprietary protocol based on H.264 codec. So if any of you guys are familiar with that, H.264 is the same thing that's utilized by YouTube or Netflix to deliver high definition video to us as consumers. What Frame has is additional intelligence and adaptive QoS capability to give you a great user experience, even if there's a changing bandwidth or resolution. So because of this, so many of the first customers of Frame, even prior to the acquisition by Nutanix, were customers like Adobe and Autodesk and SolidWorks. For example, Autodesk is one of our customers right now, and they deliver all of their training, both internal and external training that's done by Autodesk University globally is done on Frame. Before they would have these large machines that they would have to ship out for these end users, which had big powerful CPUs and GPUs, and those machines would have to be shipped out in different locations. Now they're able to use commodity hardware and just connect back into their VDI session using Frame, and it saved them hours of implementation and management time. So again, 2018, Nutanix acquired Frame, and then we've continued to evolve since as a solution, adding additional enterprise features and capabilities to continue to grow and enhance the solution still. So in a nutshell, Frame is a SaaS solution, and like other solutions, like SaaS solutions out there, like say Workday or Salesforce, the idea behind a SaaS solution is that it can be easily accessed by just an HTML5 browser. So the service we're providing is users access to virtual apps and desktops, and all a user needs is an HTML5 browser to connect to their virtual app or desktop. Historically, we've been browser first. We now also have a Frame client application, but we've always been browser first. So we're optimized for Chrome and Firefox, but really any HTML5 browser will work. So in addition to our core protocol, we have a management plane which is provided as a service. That's called the Frame Cloud Control Plane. So all of the provisioning, the authentication, the management of these VMs, power management, all of that stuff, image management is needed to typically as an infrastructure service, but we provide that as a service. So the customer does not have to deploy any other infrastructure components on their environment, and is purely provided as a service. Now, because of that, we are able to deploy on any of the three major clouds natively, AWS, Azure, or GCP, or on on-premise environments like Nutanix Acropolis Hypervisor, or for our managed services partners like Storcom, we can deliver these VMs on their AHV cluster that's managed by them. So the key thing to note here is we support native cloud or for on-premise deployments, AHV based hypervisors. So I wanted to dive into some of the key functions and features of the solution. and talk about those. So like I mentioned, we are H.264 based. We are not RDP based like majority of the traditional VDI solutions out there on the market. We are optimized for WAN and low bandwidth to be able to provide a user with a good experience. Some of the key things that Frame can do out of the box, things like clipboard synchronization. So what that really means is the ability for a user to copy and paste in and out of their virtual desktop from their end client. PDF printing to local printers, that's something which is a little unique. So if any of you guys are familiar with or worked in VDI solution, you would know that printing is always a pain point with VDI. Because of that, there's a few different ways printing is addressed in VDI solutions. Because the way printing works in VDI solutions is when a user prints in their session, it spools that print job to the local client machine, and for that to function and print correctly, you need drivers for that printer that's connected to the end user's machine on the VM. So because of that, you either need to be able to deploy those native print drivers on the VM, use universal print drivers and hope that you're covered by whatever the user is using, or then there are third-party solutions out there on the market as well, and there's a slew of them like Tricert, ThreadPrint. All of these exist to create help with printing in a VDI environment. So Frame took a very different approach to printing, and what Frame does is out of the box, when a user prints, it automatically renders that into a PDF forms and streams it to the browser. So from a user perspective, it just shows up as a PDF print, so they can use any locally attached printer to print that. So it really, out of the box, streamlines that process for majority of use cases where you don't need any other printing solution or complexity, and it gets you out of the printer management business. Same thing with file access. So traditional VDI, typically the way they handle file access is they map a user's local drive, like their C drive, into the VM session. And often that's done as an alternate drive letter because the C drive is reserved for their core VM. So the C drive of the user gets mapped as an alternate drive like a F or a G drive, and that may cause confusion because the user is not used to seeing that as a different drive, and now they have to navigate it through. So the way Frame approaches file access is users can simply drag and drop files onto their virtual desktop and it uploads it automatically in, and same thing for download, they can drop it into a folder and it downloads it just like a file off the web. So it makes it much more intuitive and just something that they're more used to these days with SaaS applications. We also support multi-monitors natively through the browser. So I believe at this point, we are the only VDI solution that can do multi-monitor support natively through the browser without any other software. We support USB devices like keyboard, mouse, headphones, microphones. We're able to do session roaming. That really means the ability for users to disconnect a session, reconnect. We support both non-persistent and persistent desktops. So wanted to see if non-persistent and persistent desktop is something that's typically very much of a VDI term. So for those that may not be familiar with non-persistent and persistent desktops, persistent desktop essentially is every user gets their own VM that's dedicated to them, meaning if I have my VM, when I log off, it goes and powers down, but it's reserved just for me and no one else can utilize that same VM. That gives me the most flexibility as a user to be able to manage my applications, install applications and everything else. But from an administration side, you're essentially managing those persistent desktops just like you would a physical machine. You have to still patch it in the same manner. You need some sort of a software solution to be able to patch those VMs, and so you're really, having the same amount of overhead for a virtual machine that you would for a physical machine. However, the most bang for your buck is typically in the non-persistent side, where you can have a gold image and provision a pool of VMs based upon that gold image. That way, the only thing you have to update when you need to patch or add or change applications is that one gold image, and it gets pushed out to the whole pool of users. Typically, the challenge with non-persistent is user profiles that you want the user settings to persist, even though they may not be able to install applications or change applications. You would like the user settings to persist. And we actually have a feature called Enterprise User Profiles, which essentially holds all the user settings in a separate virtual disk. And when a user logs off of their non-persistent desktop, those settings persist in that virtual disk. And when they kind of reconnect to another non-persistent desktop, it'll reattach that virtual disk and those settings will still persist. So you can utilize that feature paired with non-persistent to kind of get the best of both worlds. But if you did need to, we support both non-persistent and persistent desktops.
Huzu, do you have any question around, I thought maybe you can go a little bit more detail just around this concept of persistent versus non-persistent. Maybe some examples for everybody in regards to things like the capabilities of personal drives, or even if you've noticed down the bottom right-hand corner of Huzu's screen, you can see there's a little Google Drive sign. A lot of those different features there. You want to go and just real briefly what those types of things, because I think that all ties into the capabilities of making a user experience in a non-persistent environment as close to being persistent as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So typically, as best practice, you know that even in physical desktops, you want as little of the user's data to be resident on the VM or their desktop itself, right? So we typically customers will look into other cloud storage solutions like OneDrive or Dropbox or Google Drive. There's a slew of them out there, all of which are supported on Frame. And we have native integrations actually built into OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, and Box, which you can enable and disable those features literally with a flick of a switch. But basically, it will map those drives into the user's desktop. So for example, if a user has a OneDrive account and you want to enable them to be able to use their OneDrive account, they would get an icon on their virtual desktop in which they can click and provide their credentials. And once they're logged in, it maps that OneDrive drive as an alternate drive on the VM. So typically what we recommend is users' data should really not be on the VM at all and should be in some sort of a cloud storage solution or a network storage or a network drive, for example. But like Dave mentioned, we have still user settings. For example, if a user makes a change to their signature in Outlook that's in their VDI session, well, you don't want the user to keep going back in and every time they launch a desktop to go back and set their signature up again and customize all of that stuff. So all of those settings typically exist in user settings, which are located under C users %username %folder. So that enterprise user profiles feature is able to take those settings and persist that on a separate virtual disk. And that's simply as simple as literally clicking a switch to turn on enterprise user profiles or disable them. So it makes it really easy for an administrator to manage that.
Yeah, another good use case we came up with, this actually came from a client, was autosave to the personal drive location. So that way, no matter where they went, these users didn't necessarily know if they'd forgotten about something and they didn't even know that the autosave feature was turned on. They would automatically still be able to get access to that data because the autosave location was pointing at that personal drive. And even once they left the, if the session died or got terminated, when it restarted, they would automatically have that autosave data again because it was pointing to a personal drive that was in essence floating around with that username.
Yep, absolutely. Good point. Yep. So some of the other features we support is we also support both AD joined and non-domain joined instances. That also makes us very unique because we're one of the very few VDI solutions that can support both domain joined and non-domain joined. While most customers would like their VDI solutions to be domain joined, we have a number of customers that do not have that requirement to have machines that are domain joined and would rather have, from a security posture, not have machines on a domain or create a separate domain just for, like, say, contractors or third-party resources or users which do not need that authentication. And we can provide VMs that are both non-domain joined as well. So really, depending on your security posture and what you would like, you can do both. Additionally, I mentioned we support standard USB devices. We support a lot of those HID devices out of the box natively for things like flatbed scanners and other USB devices that require special like USB generic drivers. We have a Frame client application, and mainly because the browser has security built in, which disallows for certain devices to function through the browser, and those are built-in security measures that browsers have. So the only way around that is we actually have our own Frame client application, which allows for additional functionality if that's needed. Now, as I mentioned, Frame is always browser first, so we try to make any feature that we want be compatible with our out-of-the-box just through the browser. And if there are things that are required by a customer that are not supported on the browser, then we have our Frame client application to support things like that. From a security perspective, we're kind of born in the cloud, so security has always been in the forefront of our technology. So all of our authentication is SAML based. We support essentially SAML based IDPs. Anything that's SAML 2.0 or OAuth 2.0 will support. Same thing with dual factor or multi-factor authentication. So we support like things like Azure AD, ADFS, Okta, Ping, Google authentication. All of those will support out of the box. What we will not support is native LDAP, like Kerberos type authentication, because what that would require is the user credentials to be passed to our control plane. And since we are a cloud-based control plane, we don't want that from a security posture to have your user credentials be passed to our control plane, which is why that's not supported. All of these features that I went over on the previous slide, all of those can be turned on and off very easily, just with literally a click. And we can show you that as part of our demo when we go into it. Additionally, all of the data that's in between our control plane and those VMs is encrypted, including the data at rest. From a compliance perspective, we're SOC 2 Type 1 and 2 and SOC 3 compliant. We have our ISO 27001, 17, and 18 certifications. There are HIPAA compliance for those customers that require government requirements like ITAR and FedRAMP. We have those too. We have actually a separate control plane for our government use cases, which is managed by a separate operations team and support team, which is all US citizens for those use cases. So in a nutshell, what Frame allows you to do is really choose your own infrastructure, right? Whether that's a cloud platform, whether that's on-premise on AHV, or whether that's through a partner of ours like Storcom, who's providing that managed infrastructure on AHV, right? So you can choose your infrastructure, you can choose your authentication mechanism that's SAML based. Like I said, Azure AD, ADFS, Okta, Ping, anything like that would work. For on-premise or AHV deployments, a customer can bring their profile, their image in and import that, and we can utilize that. For cloud, we actually give you a base image to deploy your applications to. So we give you a base Windows OS, depending on the family of your choosing, whether that's Windows 10 or Server 2016, etc. But that image is given, and then you can just simply deploy the application that you need and start publishing that way. And that's for our cloud platform. Like I mentioned, we support cloud storage platforms, OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, and Box natively. We have native integration built in that. But we support essentially most cloud storage solutions out there on the market. Simply the agent would have to get deployed on the VM for that. Here are the different OSs that we do support based on the infrastructure. So the key thing to note here is that AHV is essentially, on-premise or managed by, say, like MSP like Storcom. For cloud, AWS, Azure, and GCP, you'll notice that Windows 10 is not available for those platforms, and primarily because Windows 10's EULA requires that Windows 10 only run in Azure cloud or on dedicated hardware, which makes it extremely cost prohibitive for it to run on any other cloud but Azure. So it's not really because of any technical reasons, but mainly because of licensing reasons. But as you can see, we support 20 Server 2016 across the board and 20 Server 2019 upcoming in the next couple of weeks for full support of that as well across all our platforms. Additionally, we have Linux platforms that are available in AWS and on-premise for CentOS 7 and Ubuntu 18.04. That's available for AHV and AWS. One thing to note here is the customer is responsible for the Microsoft licensing. Unfortunately, still can't get around any Microsoft tax or Microsoft licensing. We don't include that as part of any frame subscription. That's separate depending on what model you're delivering on. So here's kind of the infrastructure at a high level, right? So what you see in the middle here is what's provided to the customers as a control plane or as a service. So we have two types of deployment. One would be the public cloud, where AWS, Azure, or GCP, or on the right you have private cloud, which is on AHV, and that can be your own on-premise or a managed service provider's environment on AHV that's hosting your environment for you. So in cloud, what you'll notice is a user will go to the Launchpad, which is the dashboard that's provided through Frame. They'll go to a URL that's specific to the customer. The IDP would be integrated into the control plane. And based on their user's authentication and what they have access to, that session would be brokered to the VM. So one thing to note here is when the user connects, the session is brokered to the VM, but they connect directly to the VM. And that's specifically important for performance reasons. That session is not held through our control plane. There are other VDI solutions on the market out there, but that whole session is typically held through there. So from a performance perspective, especially when you get into higher graphics, that can typically add much more latency and performance degradation. Also, one thing to note here is for on-premise, we have a couple of virtual appliances that need to get deployed for our control plane to talk to some AHV components that help really provision or manage the environment. So we have two cloud connector appliances that get deployed. When a user connects, same thing, they will authenticate against a dashboard, and based on their authentication, they'll connect directly to the VM if they're internal. If they're external, in an on-premise deployment or an AHV deployment, we have what's called a streaming gateway appliance, and that acts as a reverse proxy. So that's kind of acts as a connection gateway server. And again, all of these appliances are Linux, hardened Linux virtual appliances, and all of these are included as part of this Frame subscription. There's no additional cost for purchasing these or anything. They just have to get deployed, and that's about it. One thing you'll note here, and is in cloud, we have no additional infrastructure that's needed, and that's because we are truly a cloud platform, and we have native API integrations from our cloud tenant to those cloud providers, and we do not need any sort of infrastructure servers like a lot of the traditional VDI solutions out there. They will require you to deploy additional infrastructure there for you to be able to talk back to the infrastructure. In our case, we have native API integration, and that is why we're able to quickly expand and deliver to any cloud environment globally in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, Huzu, one thing I was going to comment on this architecture that I think that we found it as an MSP to be, quite compelling from a deployment standpoint, especially with everything that happened with remote work, over the last few months, is that, with the public cloud capabilities, and we use Azure on that side, we've been able to spin up customers, get an environment up and running, tested, maybe in a small deployment or a POC type capability, and then the idea, then migrate them into, which in most cases is, for a larger deployment, more cost effective into our MSP private cloud. But we can basically start the process up in the public cloud, get you, theoretically up and running, right, Huzu? By this afternoon, we could have you up and running in one of those environments. And then from there, once the deployment, maybe you get past a pilot phase, it's not hard to migrate back onto an on-prem environment. There is no direct migration per se, but we've come up with some ways and tools that there are ways to easily get the images back out of, let's say, Azure onto an on-prem environment. So the work that goes into building out the virtual desktop per se isn't wasted. It's part of the POC process, and then basically that could easily be brought on-prem.
Absolutely.
I think that's one thing that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely. Right. So one of the things to note here is when you deploy these VMs in clouds, they're running natively on that hypervisor. So AWS's hypervisor, Azure's hypervisor, GCP's hypervisor natively. It's not like we're adding any other additional, hypervisor. We don't have a bare metal Nutanix cloud that you're deploying on. You're deploying natively in those subscriptions. And because of that, you can't simply just move that same image over because they're totally different hypervisors. But like Dave mentioned, that's where an MSP comes into play, where they can offer that service of helping move those or recreate those pools in other environments.
You can export a virtual machine out of Azure, and in essence, that Windows 10 machine is still the same Windows 10 machine. We're just putting it into a different container once it comes on-prem. And a lot of VDI, if anybody's gone down that path or thinking about going down this path, I mean, the majority of this, and Nutanix certainly makes the control part of this very simple and easy to manage. A lot of it, the configuration part, is really about setting up the desktops, getting the application set up properly, figuring out how you're going to deal with the persistent nature of these applications in a non-persistent world, and all the things that Huzu just mentioned, like enterprise profiles, how are we going to handle those, personal drives, application redirection, all those different factors are all things that go into that process. That can all be worked out and vetted out in any one of the public clouds, and all that data can easily be exported in the form of the knowledge that you use to set up that environment in Azure is no different if we did this on-prem. So the POC process and kind of documenting that process and then taking that image and moving that's the bulk of the work. That's very easy to move. That's very easy to move to an on-prem environment or into a private cloud MSP like ours after the fact. So that would be, I think that's one of the things that again makes this solution very nimble in today's environment, is that it's easy to get somebody up and running and test this and vet out processes and figure out what the final configuration will look like. Because in some deployments, in smaller deployments, running it in AWS and Azure and GCP may make sense, but as the deployment gets larger, the financials aren't really there. It's much more cost effective to do it in a MSP private cloud or even possibly on-prem yourself, because there's overhead that, even with the public cloud environments, there's a cost to it, and typically, eventually, you can overcome that cost barrier by doing it yourself. So, go ahead, Huzu.
All right. So moving on to platform hierarchy. So wanted to touch on this just a little bit. So we have kind of a 3-tiered system on our platform hierarchy. We have customer, organization, and account. So these are the 3 tiers. So at the top level is the customer entity. That's where your global settings are tied. That's where your subscription model is tied. We have 2 subscription model. We have named users or max concurrent instance. And really named user is based on total number of unique users that are logging into an environment. The max concurrent instance is a license that's actually twice as expensive as named user. What that looks at is basically the total number of VMs you are allowed to provision to support your infrastructure. So because it's, from a cost perspective, it's twice as expensive as named user, typically it makes sense to go down a max concurrent user licensing model if you have, your concurrency ratio is greater than 2. And what I mean by that is that, say you had 500 total users, but you anticipate only 100 or 150 users to be on and peak time at any given time, and you're using non-persistent desktops. well, then you're better off from a dollar perspective to go down a max concurrent user licensing model versus a named user model. But again, we both can work. We support one subscription model type per customer entity. So underneath that, we have what's called organization. It's kind of like an OU. So typically we'll see customers split up orgs between different infrastructure types. So you could potentially have, if you wanted to have, if you had different business units or lines of businesses underneath it, or even sub customers underneath you could have different environments under different cloud infrastructure. So one could be Azure, one could be a different subscription of Azure, one could be AWS, and really separate it out with different authentication mechanisms, or have everything under one org if there isn't a need for that separation. Lastly, the account. So account is kind of like a desktop pool. So every gold image tied to a pool of VMs is considered an account. So if a customer has, say, 2 different gold images, those would be considered 2 different accounts in, say, Azure or AHV or on-premise, right? You can have as many accounts as you like. It's not something you have to pay for. It's just what we term as desktop pool, essentially. So at this point, we're going to be jumping into the demo, but before that, I wanted to open it up for any questions based on what we've gone over.
As of right now, I think I asked a few questions. There aren't any other questions as of yet, but I think when we get into the demo, there'll probably be some more that pop up. I'll kind of field those and pass those along.
All right, sure. All right, so moving on to the demo. So I'm going to break out of this presentation. And what you'll notice actually here is I was presenting this PowerPoint through my virtual frame desktop. And the way you can tell that is there's some, if you look at the bottom here, you'll see this bar, and it shows some feedback information for the user. So as a user, I'm connected to this virtual desktop. It's showing me my bandwidth. It's showing me like 5 bars. So kind of like a cell phone signal, which is really great because, you know, it sets the expectations for the users that, hey, if they're connecting to their virtual desktop and they don't have great connectivity, it'll show that. So they know that, hey, maybe their experience may be a little deprecated compared to when they're accessing it from home or when they're in the office, etc. Also shows round trip latency to that VM. And again, these will change in color as well if that goes up too high. It shows how much bandwidth I'm using. At this stage, I'm only using like 1 kilobit basically because there's not a lot of change. Now, if I do something on the screen, you'll see it'll spike up and then go back down. If I click on this, it shows me other metrics of the environment, like how far I am from the server. So in this case, I'm in Dallas. This VM is actually running in AWS in Virginia, which is about 1,100 miles away. So it's fairly far, but you know, I've got decent bandwidth. So what I want to show you is some of the capabilities of the performance. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm just going to open up a browser and go to and show you what it looks like if I was to launch like a video on here. So let's see. So I'm just browsing to YouTube and I'm going to launch There we go. So I'm going to run a video with this Top Gun preview as soon as this ad finishes. And then what I'm going to do is make sure this is running in high definition. So I'm going to switch this to 1080p, right, full frames. And you're seeing this over a webinar, so it may be a little choppy to you. But me looking at this natively, this is running like just like it would be on my local machine. Now, what you'll also notice is going to start using up more bandwidth to give me that full high definition experience. Now, this is running in my virtual desktop. As you can see, I can, you know, shrink this window down. I can move this over. You can, you know, resize this obviously, and you'll notice that it's using, you know, up to like 5 megs or whatever, but it's giving me that full high definition experience that I need. Now, as an administrator, I can simulate what it's like to have lower bandwidth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throttle my bandwidth down to say under a meg, right? And I hit apply, and what you'll notice is that it's going to throttle this bandwidth down. You'll see the bandwidth indicator bar now shows 1 bar showing very low bandwidth, but you'll notice the video is still running smoothly. There's some more pixelation. There's a change of color depth, but from a user perspective, it's still providing a great user experience. In addition, if I was doing like word processing applications, like for example, just Word, which is not very graphically intensive, you'll see it doesn't need a lot of bandwidth and it's very clear. So, you know, for office productivity applications and stuff, you don't need a lot of bandwidth, and that is more than sufficient. But for if you're doing graphics workloads, if you're doing video, those kind of things, that'll require higher video, but it's still able to adapt very rapidly for that changing bandwidth. Additionally, what I can do is specifically for engineering use cases, I can even turn this into grayscale. So I'll turn on grayscale, and what you'll notice is it gets rid of the color and gives back resolution in that same bandwidth. So this is especially important for engineering use cases where resolution may be more important to them than color depth. So again, it's all kind of the capabilities of this protocol. Now, as I move this and I remove that throttle and allow it to kind of use whatever it needs, you're going to see that the bandwidth is going to start ramping up. It's going to get into full high definition video again. That experience is going to return to that full HD video quality, right? And again, all from a user's perspective, pretty transparent. Similarly, this is actually a GPU-enabled machine. So I wanted to show you some GPU capability of the protocol as well. So I'm going to run, this is a web-based graphical tool which allows, it simulates basically like AutoCAD or engineering drawings. So I'm essentially rotating this car around, which is in high resolution. It's doing rendering and shadowing on the fly. I can change, like, you know, the background. I can change the color of the car. I can change the type of the car, right? And it's doing all that on the fly. But the biggest thing here is what you're going to notice is I'm moving this around just like I would be on my local machine. That's extremely fluid. And just like a native user experience. Now, this is huge for high graphics use cases and things like that, and that's what the protocol is able to deliver. And you'll see on the bandwidth here is it uses as much bandwidth as it needs to give me that full experience, and then as it stops moving, it drops back down. So it uses it in bursts to give you that, you know, like local native experience. So that's kind of the capability of the desktop itself. So some of the other things I want to show you, I'm going to break out a full screen. What I want to show you is kind of the user experience when they go to connect to their virtual desktop. So they would go to frame.nutanix.com/whatever the customer entity is. They'll log in based on their authentication. They'll be presented with something like this, a dashboard. This could be your company logo on the back, whatever you want. And it'll have an icon to launch their desktop. And we can also publish apps. So in this case, when I hit resume, it'll reconnect me back to this desktop that I was just on. And again, you can see all this is running just in my native browser in Chrome. I can resize the desktop on the fly. You know, it's doing that all automatically. It's nothing that I have to go change settings. And again, there's not even a plugin or no software or anything installed for this to work. It's all natively just HTML5 only, right?
Huzu, can you show everybody, maybe, I don't know, on this machine, do you have a personal drive connected or a G drive or any of the other connectivity into, or
yeah,
how you, or I think you mentioned the file sharing capabilities from local to remote?
Yep, absolutely. So let me show you the basic upload download capability. So we have these, if you open up Explorer, I have these two folders called uploads and download now. You see they're empty right now. So uploads folder is empty. If I wanted to upload a file into my virtual desktop, so say I'm on a Mac right now, and this file is on my Mac desktop. If I wanted to upload this into my virtual desktop, I simply drag and drop it anywhere on the virtual desktop. And what it'll do is it'll simply upload that into uploads folder onto the VM. It's really that easy from a user perspective, very intuitive. Now I can move this file somewhere else onto my virtual desktop if I wanted to, or some other folder, but now I can edit it, change it. So what I'm going to do is, in this case, I've just opened up this Word document. It's just a simple Word document, said this is a test for Xi Frame printing. So if I wanted to print this, I will go to File, Print. Now, if I had network printers installed, I could simply choose those from the drop down here. But if I wanted to print on my local machine, I'm at home, I've got a Canon MX92 922 printer, which is like one of those multifunction scanner printers, right? So I want to print on that. So you'll notice there's this frame printer. I just hit print. And what it does is it automatically converts this into a PDF, streams it to the my browser session, and it pops up just like a regular print job off the web from a PDF. And I can choose my locally attached printer, use the full functionality of that. So anything essentially that can be rendered into PDF form will work just fine right out of the box without you needing to do anything else. All right. Now, just like uploads, download works similarly. We have a folder called Download Now. I could either right-click the file and say Download with Frame, or I can take the file and just stick it in Downloads. And what it'll do is it'll recognize, hey, there's a file available to be downloaded, and it'll stream it to my browser, just like a file off the web, and then it'll show up in my download. So it actually opened up on my separate window. So if I scroll over, here's my document on my downloads folder. Additionally, the cloud storage solutions that are there, you'll see that there's Google Drive, OneDrive that are turned white. What that means that those are enabled. And what that means is if I go to my Explorer, you'll see my Google Drive is mapped, my OneDrive is mapped natively. Now, you'll see Dropbox is grayed out. If I had a Dropbox account, I would simply click here, hit connect, and it would prompt me for my Dropbox credentials. Now, when I enter those credentials as a user, those credentials are held on my local browser. Nothing is passed to our Frame control plane from a security perspective. So those credentials will just be held locally on the browser, and it'll map that drive into this VM. Also, it'll cache those credentials on the user's local browser, so when I connect or reconnect next time, it'll automatically map those drives. Now, all of these can be turned on or off very easily just in your admin console, and I can show you how to do that. But basically, it's that easy, and you've got native integration. There's no Google Drive or OneDrive agent installed on this VM. Now, if you wanted additional functionality from OneDrive, say like Teams folders and stuff like that, then I would recommend that the agent be installed on the VM instead of using these native integration. All right. So the other thing I'm going to show is the admin side of this. So actually, let me show you a couple more things. Actually, here's another desktop. This is a simple 2 vCPU, 8 gigs of RAM instance in AWS. So a much smaller non-GPU enabled machine. Now, I'm going to disconnect from here, and it'll take me to that launchpad. So again, it's got that icon. Now, as an administrator, if I click on my name here, I can go to dashboard. It takes me to the admin console. Like I mentioned, we are a SaaS platform, so you don't need to remote into a server. You don't need to launch an MMC. All of our management is all just based through the SaaS applications, right? So here, you'll see the 3 tiers I was talking about: the account, the organization, and customer entity. Now, this is the summary page, so it shows that, hey, this machine is running in AWS in Ohio. I was connected for this long. I can see the timeline of when I was connected, how long it took me to connect, how long I was on for, this kind of information. I could close the session if I wanted to right from here. Sandbox is where I would go for the gold image. That is our term for gold image. So if I wanted to make changes to this image, I would simply power on the VM, make any changes that I want, maybe install patches, maybe add or remove any applications. Once I'm done, I simply log off and I hit publish. And that's it. And what the publish will do is it'll automatically, first of all, make a snapshot so you have a place to roll back if you needed to. And then it'll, based on your capacity settings, provision a pool of VMs based on this gold image. So if I go to the capacity, that's where it's going to specify how many VMs I want to provision. Now, and this is in cloud, so I have these different cloud instances available: Air, Edge, and Pro. These are Nutanix terms, but they correlate to different instance sizes on the cloud. So, for example, an Air 8 is a 2 vCPU, 8 gigs of RAM. It's a T2 large, and I have 5 of those provisioned, or and I don't have any of these other ones provisioned. And based on that, if I go to the status, you'll see that it's provisioning those VMs in cloud and it's keeping those powered off. So what you'll notice is that because this is in cloud, you're concerned about your cloud spend. So you don't necessarily want to keep all your machines powered on because that's what you get charged for. So you can totally customize how many VMs you want to provision, how many you want to buffer on. So if I had, say, 100 VMs here, I could say, you know what, I just want to buffer just 2 of them. So only 2 are going to be available and waiting for a user to connect, while the rest of them stay powered off, right? I could do this through here, or I can even specify a specific time zone, and I can say, hey, during 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. During the week, only then do I want to buffer. Outside of that, I want to leave them all off, and the user can wait an extra minute for the machine to power on and then connect. So it just conserves your cloud spend. Now, if you're doing this on-premise where it's your infrastructure, then maybe you don't care about that infrastructure usage, and you can say, hey, if I have 100 VMs, I want all 100 to stay powered on because I've already sized my infrastructure for that. I noticed a couple of questions in there. Is there?
Yeah, I think one question that came up was around I think the client side. Someone asked a question around, what are the client requirements? I think maybe we talked a little bit about that. Obviously, as you said, it's HTML5 browser based.
Yep.
From
I
a
can
requirement
actually go in that. So basically, yeah, any device with an HTML5 browser would work essentially. So Mac, Chromebooks, Windows machines, Linux machines, any endpoint that has a Chrome browser would work. In addition, we also have our Frame client application that's available for Linux, Mac, and Windows machines. So even thin clients, if you're using, say, Linux-based or Windows embedded Linux or Windows embedded thin clients, you can deploy our Frame app on that, and we have customers utilizing that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, the client side requirements are very, very small in comparison to what's happening on the other side, which is where the session is. We've tested it also
great
using
point.
some.
So yeah, all that stuff that you were seeing that I was doing on GPU side, it was using that VM's CPU and GPU capabilities. Basically, on the client side, if you can watch a YouTube video, your client is capable of running Frame.
Yep. One last thing I think before we're starting to get close to the hour here. Talk a little bit about the Launchpad's application versus desktop, and also maybe we can go into real briefly what you and I were talking about, the differences between app virtualization, which some of the folks here may be familiar with. What is the difference between what Nutanix is doing with Frame and application Launchpads versus app virtualization?
Yeah. So yeah, one thing to note here is we are a VDI solution. We are not a multi-session host technology. So we're not like XenApp or RDS where multiple users are connecting to a single VM. We are always one-to-one. We are a VDI solution. However, we can still deploy apps, but it's still done on a one-to-one basis. So for example, I can, you saw the Launchpad for a desktop where you saw an icon for just desktop, but I could just as easily have a Launchpad for apps. Now on the back end, it's still using that same VM, but when I launch, say, Excel, it's using that same virtual desktop, but I'm utilizing it. Oh, let me relaunch. I think it was still enabled for my desktop, but basically it's using that same virtual desktop on the background, and it's publishing just the app, so I can only see the app that's available to me, even though I'm running on that same desktop. So you'll see there's no wallpaper that I was using. There's no start menu. I can't launch anything else aside from just the apps that are provisioned to me. So I can present it both as a desktop or mask it so that only specific apps are exposed to the user. So we can do it both ways. Now, similarly, if you have a use case where you need a VPN client, you could potentially publish that in as an app form and have the users launch that, and they'll launch the VPN client and then connect to any of their apps. And again, they can do that via desktop or even in this app format, which makes it a little unique because that's something you can't really do in a multi-session environment, because you can't really allow one user to be able to launch a, say, for example, a VPN client and not impact the others that are on that server. So like I mentioned, we are a one-to-one, we are a VDI solution. So every user that connects will connect to their individual VM. It avoids like what we call noisy neighbor, meaning, you know, one resource hogging up the resources for other resources or impacting others. This way, everyone has is able to get a great user experience.
I think one good example or kind of use case of how app publishing versus app virtualization works in the Nutanix world was what you and I were talking about earlier. Was the VPN client.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that a VPN client could actually be launched in an application desktop, and then that same client connection would still be established, and any subsequent application that was launched after that would still have all the same connectivity and routing that would exist, because the Windows 10 desktop under the hood is still the same Windows 10 desktop with the client connection.
Yep, exactly. The other thing I want to show you, very briefly touch on before we wrap up, is these settings. So all those settings that I showed you, this is how easy it is to literally turn on and off those features. So if I wanted to turn off any of those cloud storage solutions, clipboard integration, mapping, I can turn off clipboard mapping on and off, or set the direction, ability to download, upload, set my max bandwidth, allow or disallow users to be able to change that, my disconnect timeout. All that can be done with a flip of a switch without any complicated configuration, policies, or anything like that. Same thing with domain joins. If I wanted to domain join this pool of VMs, simply enable domain join, provide my domain credentials, and have that pool machine domain join. Same thing with profiles. If I want to allow profiles to be persisted, I can simply just turn on enterprise profiles, specify the size, hit save, and I'm done. So with all of our Nutanix technologies, it's always based on simplicity and being a delight, both from a user as well as an admin perspective, and that's what we try to deliver on. So I know we're kind of getting close to the end of the time. I wanted to see if there are any other questions before we wrap up.
Right now, I think we've gone over most of them. We've kind of helped direct some of those. I think we'll see if anybody else has any more questions. Before everybody goes, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi Hoff with Storcom, and she is going to do the drawing for we're giving away a JBL Bluetooth speaker, I guess, today. Heidi, can you?
Hi guys, so I have just selected the winner, and it is Francis Romberg. So I will be reaching out to you after the webinar to get your address. So congratulations.
Good, thank you. Are there any more questions at this point? You could type anything in, or obviously we can follow up. As I said at the beginning, if anybody wants to, test out this platform and see what a VM would look like and run and get the user experience, we're happy to help and assist with that. We can easily load up a few applications if you want to see what it's like. We can set up a VPN client into your environment if you want to test something to see how the application performs. So all those are options. Thank you again for attending today's seminar, and hopefully you'll come back for the next one. And thank you, Huzu, very much for your time today in presenting. You did a great job. Hopefully everybody found this informative. We'll follow up and see if there's any additional questions later, but feel free to reach out to us in the meantime.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate you all's time.
Thanks everyone.